Good morning, and welcome to the first webinar in our Expanding CalFresh to SSI Recipients Access for All Guest Speaker webinar series. My name is Alexis Fernandez, and I am the Chief of the CalFresh Policy Bureau here at the California Department of Social Services, CalFresh and Nutrition Branch, as well as your host for today's webinar. As you know, we've come together for this webinar series as a result of a big change in CalFresh eligibility starting June 1st, 2019. The expansion of CalFresh to SSI recipients. This expansion will significantly increase the number of Californians eligible for CalFresh across the state. This is a great opportunity to spend more time thinking about how we can truly make CalFresh benefits accessible to all. Like all Californians, SSI recipients are diverse. This diversity, which, by the way, I think makes California a great state to work and live, requires us to be intentional when planning for such a significant policy change. We hope that today you take one quote-unquote nugget of information, a new perspective, or a new way of thinking about how you can most effectively do your work each day from each of our guest speakers. We then hope that you incorporate these lessons learned into your planning as we head toward June 2019. As I mentioned, the intent of this webinar series is to provide a platform for a range of guest speakers to address the topic of making CalFresh accessible to all. Throughout the series, we will discuss serving people with disabilities, serving seniors, serving diverse communities, and more. Today's webinar presentation is about serving people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. We are joined today by a couple of great speakers from the San Francisco Area Agency on Aging. We'll be introducing them in just a few minutes. First, let's go over some logistics and give everyone a quick refresher on the policy change that brought us all together for this great series. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will be in listen-only mode, which means that you can connect via your computer or phone to the audio, but all lines will be muted during the presentation. Which brings me to my next logistical detail. How can you ask questions? You can ask questions by using the question pane feature on the right-hand side of your screen. For today's presentation, we won't be answering questions live, but you can submit them anytime during the presentation, and responses will be provided after the webinar. As well, responses will be posted on our website, along with all the materials and a recording of today's presentation. Next, I will make a quick sales pitch for the upcoming webinars in our Access for All Guest Speaker series. On April 2nd, we'll gather to discuss serving people with disabilities. On April 9th, serving seniors. On April 16th, serving people in multiple languages and welcoming immigrants. And on April 16th, our topic will be serving diverse communities and advancing racial equity. All the guest speakers to this series are also listed, and if you haven't yet registered for these webinars, you should do so today at our website, which is linked in this PowerPoint and in the invitation that you may have received before the live presentation. If you're not able to attend live and in person, don't worry, everything will be recorded and posted per usual. All right. But before I turn it over to our guest speaker, let's provide everyone with a quick review of the upcoming policy changes that will expand CalFresh to SSI recipients. California's cash-out policy started in 1974 when the federal government began the combined federal-state SSI-SSP program. At the time, states were allowed to increase the SSP portion of the grant instead of administering what was then known as the food stamp program. California opted for this cash-out policy and increased the monthly SSP grant by $10. Back then, the change made sense. It was an efficient way to get food benefits to an eligible population. Under the cash-out policy, SSI recipients have been ineligible for CalFresh food benefits because, in theory, they were already receiving the value of CalFresh within their SSP grant. The challenge is that over time, the value of CalFresh benefits has increased with the rate of inflation, while the SSI cash-in amount has remained flat or lost relative value. This means that many SSI recipients living on very limited budgets intended to cover all basic needs are likely to have unmet food needs, but are unable to apply for CalFresh. However, the good news is that the 18-19 state budget reversed the policy known as cash out. This means that people receiving SSI/SSP will be able to apply for CalFresh on or after June 1st, 2019, and if they're otherwise eligible, will receive food benefits in addition to their SSI/SSP grant. This is an important point, and I'm going to emphasize it, double down on clarifying that there will be no change to the combined SSI/SSP benefit amount as a result of this policy change. SSI/SSP recipients will be able to receive both their regular SSI/SSP grant amount and CalFresh benefits. For the purposes of determining CalFresh eligibility, all SSI recipients will be considered under the CalFresh rules for households with elderly and/or disabled members. Beginning June 1st, a large influx of these newly eligible SSI/SSP recipients are expected to apply for CalFresh. Therefore, we're taking this as an opportunity to revisit the concept of making CalFresh accessible to all and really taking time to think about this diverse population and how we serve them effectively. If, like me, you're a policy wonk and you want more details on the policy change, which we're not going to cover after this slide today, I would encourage you again to visit our website and take a look at the recorded materials for the policy webinar series. There you will find a lot more about CalFresh eligibility rules for this policy change. Today, though, we're going to focus on increasing access for all. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing our three guest speakers, Melissa McGee, Tom Nolan, and Dana Levitt from the San Francisco Department of Aging and Adult Services, which is the Area Agency on Aging in San Francisco. They have some really great content to share with us today, including Tom's reflections on his personal experiences, as well as some practical tips that can be applied in your everyday work. So, if Tom, Melissa, and Dana are on the line and ready, I'll hand it off to you.
We are here.
Great. We can hear you.
Okay.
Go ahead and let's get started.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. So my name's Melissa McGee, and I am going to go first and just give a little overview of the law that got us where we are today. But first, the training that we provide, usually live to all our DAS employees and community partners, is a training that Tom, Dan, and I attended with Open House, which is a local San Francisco-based nonprofit agency serving the LGBTQ population. So they provided us with an all-day train the trainer opportunity, and then the three of us took that information and from that developed our hour and 15-minute training that we provide. So the agenda that you see on the slide, and this is sort of the agenda we include in the live training. We have introductions, which you've heard who we are. We have some working agreements, which you'll see on the next slide or in a couple slides. We'll go over the ordinances, both San Francisco and the state ordinance that outlines the collection of SOGI data. Tom will provide a historical perspective, and Dana will talk about practical applications and implementation of asking the questions. Next slide. So the San Francisco Department of Aging and Adult Services is the AAA for San Francisco County. San Francisco is a city and county, so the City Department of Aging is also the AAA for the County of San Francisco. The department is charged with planning, coordinating, and advocating for community-based services for older adults and adults with disabilities, and also coordinates a comprehensive range of services. So DAS, as the department is called, includes the Office on the Aging, which provides community services and programs. We have an integrated intake unit at our benefits and resource hub. The department has the public guardian, public conservator, and public administrator programs, as well as adult protective services, in-home supportive services, and the County Veteran Service Office. Next slide. I'm sorry, I didn't know. At the bottom of that slide is also our website, so if you want more information about our department. Thank you. Next slide. So when we do our live training session, we have these working agreements that we start out with, and we thought, just for your benefit, it'd be nice to include them here. So we have these working agreements that we go through and ask everyone to agree to. So the first is listen for understanding and be open to new perspectives. In our live session, there is some interactive components, so we encourage people to use I statements when they share knowledge and experience, and share time so all can participate. Also, that it's okay to disagree, however, no blame, shame, or attack. And then we ask everyone to respect confidentiality as a way of creating a safe environment. And then we say to the group, can everyone agree to these for the duration of this session? That's how we use the working agreements. Next slide. So as I mentioned, and as you may or may not know, the collection of SOGI data started with an ordinance in San Francisco, and then a year later was followed by a state law. So the ordinance in San Francisco, and for those of you who want to look up the specific law, the information is there, but it required city departments and contractors that provide healthcare and social services to collect and analyze data concerning sexual orientation and gender identity. And this was introduced to the Board of Supervisors by Scott Wiener, who's now state senator. The board passed it in July of 2016. It was signed by then Mayor Ed Lee, and then it became effective July 1st, 2017 in San Francisco. Next slide. Also, then the state had a similar ordinance. It was Assembly Bill 959, and this required the 4 specific state agencies and to collect data: public health, social services, healthcare services, and aging. And this law was actually passed in October 2015, but with an effective implementation date no later than July 1st, 2018. So for us, we were doing it in San Francisco, all the units at the Department of Aging, except for IHSS, because it's a state-run program, so they started collecting data in 2018. So we've been doing it for a while. So that's just some background, and I want to introduce Tom Nolan, who will talk about personal and historical perspective. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Melissa. My name is Tom Nolan, and my role here this morning is to talk about the lived experience I had as an LGBT senior. I'm 74 years old, and I've been out publicly for 35 years plus. I live in San Francisco with my partner, Larry Friesen. We've been together for 42 years. The goal here today, though, is to talk about a little bit about me, but mostly about the atmosphere in which clients coming to you who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s will have the experiences they've had. So in my case, I come from an Irish Catholic family in upstate New York. We had no talk of sex at all, ever. Only mention of homosexuality in my little community with kids calling each other fag and queer, no real understanding about any of that. No. I wanted to be a Catholic priest, so I became an altar boy at 7, and I wound up in a Catholic seminary for 2.5 years, and then went to a Jesuit school in Syracuse, New York. I had the good fortune to study under Father John McNeil, who had written a book called The Church and the Homosexual. At this time, I hadn't thought about myself in terms of this at all. So it's a very my experience is a gradual evolving, unfolding of who I am, who I really am. So I went to Le Moyne, graduated from there, and then I did another degree at Colgate University. And the summer after I graduated, I did a Black literature course co-taught with an African-American friend, and had a seminal conversation that evening. To me, it was an extremely important evening. I was going down to North Carolina, and he said, you should go to North Carolina Central to meet women. I said, well, John, that's a black school. He said, yeah. And I said, well, I'm an Irish Catholic Democrat from upstate New York who wants to have lots of babies and support my political career. And he said, man, I feel sorry for you. It was like one of those moments, like, why? He said, well, you systematically excluded 99% of the women in the world. And that was a beginning of an awakening for me. Later on, became much more than a woman. Finding only a woman could be a man as well. So at Duke University, I met a woman. We married, lived together for several years, and I had dated women earlier in my life, none very seriously. And I also, when I look back, I know that as a kid, in grammar school and in college, I actually had crushes on men, but I didn't identify it as such. I never thought about it that way. So it's just a gradually dawning thing. I met a man after my wife and I divorced. I met a man in the gay bar, fell madly in love, still felt so open-minded that I could love anybody, with anyone. Soon, however, I accepted the fact that I am, in fact, a gay man. Looking back, these crushes were there, but I didn't notice those at the time. Then I met another man, and we moved in together, and eventually moved to San Francisco. But the experience that my colleagues, my peers were having at that time was substantially different. Well, I didn't realize that I was gay really until my 20s. A lot of my friends and people to this day, they knew they were gay, they knew they were LGBTQ very early on, 5 or 6 years old. Sometimes they couldn't identify it, but they knew what it was. They knew they were different, and that wasn't my case at all. But in those days, the public discussion of homosexuality was that it was a very sad life. Life magazine did a major piece on the sad life of the homosexual. It was picked up by other publications and television shows. The life was made sad by the government itself, with laws against sodomy and all kinds of things. The medical community viewed it as a mental illness, and religious institutions condemned it as sinful and evil, and a lot of them still do. So I met the man I mentioned. I moved to San Francisco in 1979, and when we got here, it was a great feeling of liberation. It was amazing we come from Roanoke, Virginia, a very conservative place, very difficult to be an openly gay person there. We got to San Francisco. One of the first things we did was to go see the Gay Freedom Day parade. It's coming down Market Street, and the band was playing If They Could See Me Now. Mm-hmm. It was one of those great moments in my life. I said, wow, we're free. And for a number of years, several years, it was that great freedom that we had. We could be whatever we wanted to be. We wouldn't have to worry about being gay. However, in 1982 was the first appearance of what they called at the time gay cancer. And I remember being in the Castro looking at the drugstore window, and they had a clipping from the LA Times about five gay men in LA that came down with this mysterious illness, they call it gay cancer, sarcoma, and that. So in 1984, that began a very trying period for all of us. My partner and I had lived in a house with 4 died in their 30s, all kinds of other people died. I was any number of funerals, and had the power of attorney for a number of friends. But my whole world was collapsing. But I ran for the Board of Supervisors in San Mateo County, and I won. And I became, at that point, one of 14 openly gay elected officials in the country. I used that position to do work on non-discrimination, created an AIDS task force, and that sort of thing. I became president of the board for the first time, and I was going up to a meeting in Marin County. I drove across the Golden Gate Bridge, and spectacular San Francisco morning. The sun was shining out there. Maybe it was 9:30 or 10 o'clock. And I just was so pleased with myself that I had achieved a lifelong goal. I wanted to be a politician as well as a priest for many, many years. And here I was, president of the board, and very proud of myself. And then I immediately began to think about how much greater my celebration would be if the people that I loved, so many of them, were still there with me, were able to be and enjoyed my success at that point, and me in turn to enjoy wherever they were in their lives. That's another one of these experiences that I'll just never forget. After 8 years on the Board of Supervisors in San Mateo, I became Executive Director of Project Open Hand in San Francisco. That's an organization that was founded in 1985 to provide meals with love for persons with AIDS. And when I got there, the organization was serving about 2,000 meals, hot meals a day in San Francisco and Alameda County. And I'm sure it's safe to say that I was in a pretty deep depression because of all the death and going on around me, people very close to me. And I thought, I'm going to be the last one here. But Open Hand, I had to go out and deliver meals pretty much every day. Helped And by getting involved, getting engaged in the life of people with AIDS and who are dying, it really helped bring me out of where I was in despair. I began working there, and I was there for 17 years. And then I decided I want to do one more thing. So I decided to get a job with the Department of Aging and Adult Services, a part-time job, and it's called Manager of Special Projects. And the very first special project was working with the LGBT Aging Policy Task Force. The city had created this task force, and they charged it with coming back with actionable recommendations. And so the task force, the first thing they did a survey. We had 616 respondents to that survey. We did focus groups. We had committees. We had expert testimony. 13 recommendations emerged from this, and it's published 5 years ago this very month. And the first recommendation that came out of the task force was to collect demographic data, because at that point, still to some degree today, we find a lot of what we know about this community is largely of an anecdotal nature. We needed hard facts, hard data in order to meet the needs of these communities. So out of this task force, the recommendations came out, and some of the findings are really startling to us. One was that 60% of these LGBTQ seniors live alone, 40% are low income, 50% do not feel comfortable as LGBT seniors in alcohol, drug, congregate meal programs, 44% experience discrimination based on their sexual orientation, gender identity in the last 12 months. 78% felt it would be unsafe to be out in a long-term care facility as an LGBT person. 33% of the males are living with HIV, and 15% seriously committed suicide within the last 12 months. Transgenders and those living in poverty and those living alone are more likely to have poor health. The task force heard monthly recommendations, did the research, and produced this document, LGBT Aging at the Golden Gate, San Francisco Policy Issues and Recommendations. And I'm happy to report today that of the 13 recommendations, 11 have been completed, and 2 others are being worked on right now, which is, I think, is a great record for a government body, the task force. These things often wind up on the shelves, and this one didn't. And it did, because a lot of people really cared about it. Some of the recommendations are a Bill of Rights for LGBT folks in long-term care facilities, cultural humility training for our city departments and our contractors, financial and legal literacy, LGBT case management, dementia awareness and care, and housing issues. The very first recommendation is the reason why we are here today, namely the collection of demographic data. Excuse me. I was on a roll right then, wasn't I? So the first recommendation is the reason we're here today, namely the collection of demographic data. Much current information, largely anecdotal. We need more complete information so we can serve this population better. So the 3 main, as I look back on everything the task force did and my own reflections on how this community is different than others, there are 3 factors. One is discrimination and the fear of discrimination. Many people, unlike myself as a younger person, had major discrimination against them. They lost jobs, housing, all kinds of humiliation, jail, all sorts of things. So that's one factor. The second is isolation, and we realize that isolation is common to many older adults. But this is exacerbated by the fact that most of us at my age, don't have children or grandchildren who might be able to care for us when we need their care. And the big thing, final big thing, AIDS and the decimation it brought to our families of choice. A lot of us feel like we're going to live to old age for these folks, and they died in their 30s and their 40s. So the key point of this legislation...
Next slide.
Oh, okay. The key point of this legislation, this is not unlike other demographic questions we routinely ask. We're required to ask, but participation by clients is voluntary and will in no way affect their eligibility for services. So I think our experience so far has been a very positive one. People respond to this thing, and part of the goal is, of course, to offer some recognition that we know we're serving this population, and we want to do a better job all the time. And with that, I turn it over to Dan Lovett.
Next slide.
So my role, next slide. My name is Dana Levitt, and I'm one of the supervisors in our DOS Integrated Intake Unit. And we were charged with starting this in July of 2017. So we've been doing this for a long time. We're social workers that are over at our resource hub, and we do a lot of referrals for many of the services that we provide to our consumers in the community. So it's really important, like Tom had mentioned, is that really the goal of this new legislation is to really ensure, to help us understand, but also to ensure that our LGBTQ community of seniors are fully seen, welcomed, and valued. So it's important to understand where we came from, to understand the historical perspective of older adults, so that our organizational practices can respond to this and to provide them the opportunity so that we can respond in culturally sensitive ways for services and care. Tom's going to excuse himself. Oh, it's okay. So we were very happy to provide or to attend the training by open house here in our community. We're definitely the train the trainer model. This curriculum was built around the framework and the concept of cultural humility, which I really am happy to understand, because I've been a social worker for 25 years, and for many, many years we talked about cultural competency. And that never really sat well with me, because it felt like, how am I supposed to be competent about someone else's experience? And so cultural humility is a framework and a way of kind of seeing things, where you come to the table with just understanding your own experience. For example, I'm a lesbian woman, I have 2 kids, my partner and I have been together for 20 years. I can only be an expert in my own experience. I'm only an expert in Dana. I can't even really translate mine into other lesbians, other lesbian moms. And so with cultural humility, it's a lifelong journey of learning, where we're attempting to gain sensitivity and understanding so that we can appropriately respond to cultural differences. And I think that the most important takeaway from this is that we are actively open, we're listening, we're engaging with all the various different perspectives that there are. So just to have that understanding of where this training came from, I think will help you understand as we move forward. So in order to talk about these 3 questions being added to our demographic information, it's really meaningful to understand and acknowledge some of the traditional assumptions of what we come from. And I often like to describe it as having kind of a thumbprint on our brain, where the society that we grew up in has done this in our brain, and sometimes we don't even think about it. And so we take a step back and we look at where we came from, and then we look forward to where we're heading and where we're in the midst of. On the slide, the binary slide, it helps describe some of these traditional assumptions that we have. So sex refers to our sex that was determined at the time of birth, and that's usually determined by our genitalia. So the question I usually ask is, when someone says that they had a baby, one of the first questions we ask is it a boy or a girl? Gender identity can be defined as how we feel inside, our truest sense of self. Gender expression is how we present in the world, how we dress, how we talk, how we walk, what our hair looks like. And sexual orientation is defined as one's primary physical, romantic, or emotional attachment, and that's to either the same sex or the opposite sex. So when we're using this traditional binary slide here, the example would be that you have a child that at the time of birth is determined, based on genitalia, to be female. There is the natural assumption that as she grows, that she will identify as a woman. She then will, according to tradition, express herself in a feminine way. And the final link to this chain of assumptions is that we would historically be attracted to the opposite sex. So you can see in the binary system, you have up and down for both female and male. So to challenge this traditional framework, next slide, I would like to introduce the concept of identity spectrum or continuum. And if any of you have teenagers, it's really interesting to listen to teenagers these days, because they're kind of they're growing up in a period of time that's really kind of exciting in some ways. It's a period of time where we're actually trying to allow people to identify, and we're allowing people to present themselves as they choose. So this continuum is very inclusive, and that's the way that this continuum has been built, so that you have the characteristics actually on the left side, and then you have a spectrum, so that anybody can be represented on this continuum. And that's the nature of its inclusive nature. So using those same characteristics, we can think of a couple examples, one of which we all grew up with and we all had a name for, and that's a tomboy. And that's an individual who their sex assigned at birth was female, they identify as a woman, but their expression may be towards the middle or closer to the masculine side. That's an example. Another example might be a transgender individual who, for example, was assigned female at birth, who may not want to present, who may not only want to represent as a male, but also be affirmed in their gender identity as a male. You can see all of this on the continuum. They can feel included and accepted and celebrated, frankly, in this continuum. The last example that helps people understand, and it's really important to understand these characteristics, because this is in fact what the 3 questions embody. The example is actually Caitlyn Jenner, and the reason that's one that they use is because it was so public. So in order to help you understand where people fall, we're going to use the example of Caitlyn Jenner. So what do we know about Caitlyn Jenner? The sex assigned at birth was male. The gender identity is female, woman. The gender expression, from what I've seen from all the pictures and people, is that she is on the feminine side of the continuum. And sexual orientation. I'm not current on my People magazine. I don't know if more's come out, but my understanding is that we don't know. We don't know where she falls on that continuum. But that's to help us understand this new concept. It challenges our traditional beliefs, and it moves us in a direction where everyone can be represented and they can see themselves. One of the most frequent questions that has come up, and we've been doing this training since May of 2017, is that people really feel like, why do we have to ask these questions about sex? And I just want to be really clear that these questions are not about sex. These questions are about how a person feels inside, how they self-identify, and it represents their loving relationships. So please just, when you're asking these 3 questions, always keep that in mind, because you may even hear that from a client, and you really need to feel comfortable enough to say, we are asking these questions because it's really important for us to understand the clients that we're serving so that we can provide better services in the future. And that's part of our best practices that we'll discuss a little bit more in detail in a minute. So some of the best practices that we have gathered over the 2 years that we've been kind of providing the training and providing actually the service and the questions is, oh, I'm sorry, next slide, is one that as practitioners, if we are able to embrace cultural humility truly and honestly, that it allows us to understand, okay, I'm sorry, I'm distracted here momentarily. Thank you, there's the slide. With cultural humility, that if we truly embrace it, we're able to ask these 3 questions and we're able to respond to people if they have either questions or whether they need to have any sort of clarifications, and we feel comfortable in that. In addition, we want to create a culture of change. And that means many different things. It may mean that we provide an environment, whether we have clients walking in or we're going out to their homes, there's many things that we can do to help create a culture of change. And one of it might be the language that we choose to use. If we're using kind of more accepting language, that's helpful. If you're in an environment where people walk in, you may want to include things like rainbow flags, literature that talks about the LGBTQ community, certainly using the inclusive language. Very similar to what you want to provide. Here at DOS, we've made a really conscious effort in a lot of our areas where the community comes into it, including the hub, the center that I work in, is that they want everyone represented. So they have pictures of 2 men, 2 women, different ethnicities, veterans and civilians. We want to make sure that everyone who walks in that door, we also have stuff for different languages so that people know that they can ask to speak to someone in different languages. So you want to make sure that you're creating an environment where anybody who walks in that door feels welcome. And that's what part of culture change is. With the 3 questions in mind, we want to make sure that we ask the questions of everyone. We don't try to make any sort of preemptive decision about that based on who's sitting in front of us. It's just a standard thing that we do. We ask these questions of everyone, and we use language when we're working with people that is inclusive. We do not want to assume one's sexual orientation or gender identity based on either how they look or things such as their family membership. Because another good example of Tom is that he's been married and divorced. In just knowing that about him, if he walks in a building, we don't make the assumption because of that he's straight. It's important to remember not only that people are fluid over time, but it's also important to remember that anybody can get married. And so that needs to be kind of not something that's taken for granted. One of the really important things that I learned in this training was that one of the most important and profound things you can do when you have a first interaction with people, whether it's on the phone or in person, and a very respectful thing to do, is to say, how would you like to be addressed, to include name, title, pronoun. Next slide. And it's a really powerful statement because you're putting it in their lap right away. It is important to me that you are able to be who you want to be, and then I'm going to respect that. And so that's a good social work technique that anybody can use. And it was a really learning thing for me. I mean, I've been a social worker 25 years. And when I heard that, it was just like, wow, that's fantastic. That is the way to start any interaction with anyone. Put them in charge of creating an environment where you're really being respectful. Once again, do not assume one's sexual orientation or gender identity based on their family, partnership status. A lot of times when we've done trainings, they kind of have been like, well, you at DOS Integrated Intake just asked these questions. I'm doing an annual review. Do I have to ask them again? That's a really valid question. And what I like to remind people is that there's two things that could happen. One is that things are fluid. And so, yes, you do want to ask these questions again because you want to give people the opportunity to clarify from year to year. And the other thing I like to talk to people about is sometimes people don't feel safe. As we heard from Tom, the majority of seniors are concerned about that based on historical factors. And so if you just met them, they might not want to, even though you've given them the opportunity, they might not be ready to give you that information. But maybe a year later or 2 years later, and they've had contact with you, and they have a little bit of a rapport and a little bit of trust, when you ask them again, it may be that opportunity that they decide that they're going to tell you who they are. And so what's wonderful is that when you ask them at these annual reviews, that they continue to hear that you are important to us, even if they decide not to share with us that information, which once again, Tom said, we're obligated to ask, but it is voluntary how they choose to respond. The other thing is, please do not skip the questions. I challenge you to understand that this is a group of individuals that have largely felt invisible over all the years. And so I want you to challenge you with that so that we don't continue to say, well, if I don't ask them, I'm not discriminating. Well, but if you don't ask, you're not honoring either. And so it's really important to always not skip the questions, to teach it also as a teachable moment. So, and that's the part that people have to kind of practice. The more practice you do, the better you'll feel about things. But feeling comfortable to answer people's questions. If they're confused, allowing them the opportunity to ask questions and for you to be able to answer them so that potentially they'll be able to answer the question the way they'd like to. Next slide. It's very important also to not set these questions apart. If you're doing that, I think sometimes people want to, couch it by, well, I got to ask a couple, sensitive questions. I hope you don't mind. You don't have to answer. You're kind of setting up the stage for someone to actually have a reaction. And we've really kind of understood that when we started rolling this out. So we just treat it as just one more piece of demographic information. And to be honest with you, because, and I was going to talk about it a little bit later, but there's been a lot of anxiety around talking about these three questions. And I think I can just tell you from the experiences that we had, because we had experience even a year prior to it starting at the state level, for all of our anxiety and of all of our, preparing, that it actually went very smoothly. So I hope that helps people feel good about, getting ready and launching and asking these three questions and taking the information. One of the things that could be important and to help you so that you're not setting these questions apart, and in our tools, we actually just put it smack dab in the middle. So you have questions about, their birth date and their social security number, and then their ethnicity and their language, and then we have the three SOGI questions. And so for us, it was really important to put things in, and because nobody wants to answer these personal questions anyway. I had a group of IHSS workers, and we were talking to them, and we all had a good laugh together, because I said, my goodness, you're like asking them questions about their bathing and their toileting, and like this is nothing compared to the really personal questions you ask. And we all kind of had a good laugh, because when you put it in perspective, this really just needs to be treated as another piece of demographic information. And I challenge you to then ask these questions to kind of fight against this historical feeling of feeling invisible, to actually say to them, even if however they answer it, aside from all that, it's the fact that you actually asked it sets the stage for somebody to say, wow, they really are appreciating everyone. And I think that it potentially is a very good feeling for everybody. Lastly, I just wanted to reemphasize that the more comfortable you are with the material, with the questions, the easier it is to implement. And so one of the things that we do in our training is we do a lot of role playing so that people can practice, because it really is about practice. After you've had a couple people either ask you questions because they don't understand what you're asking or have a reaction because they don't want to answer it, after a week, if you've been doing it, you're going to be much better than you were, on day one. And so it's just really important. And if you're able to, with your coworkers, with your supervisor, as a supervisory group of individuals, if you guys are able to then take these role plays and actually try it, I think that it'll help people feel a little bit more confident when you're rolling it out. And I just want to talk about, I think, one other quick thing in regards to not setting the questions apart. One of the best practices that you can do is before you ask any demographic information, because it's all personal. And everybody does have sometimes an issue with, why are you asking me all these questions? It's almost a good preemptive thing to do to have what we call an affirming statement. So at the beginning of any demographic section, what you might say, and everybody has their own style and their own words, and so maybe just spending a little bit of time thinking about how you would present, I'm going to be asking some questions. One example is that this is an example. We're going to be starting an IHSS application. I wanted to let you know that we're going to start with some basic demographic questions. And the reason we ask these is that we really want to become familiar and understand the clients that we're serving. And with that information, we will try to provide better services in the future. If you preemptively say something like that, it oftentimes can end up helping you in the long run, so that because you've set the stage, this is why we need the information and this is what we're going to do with it. And so that was one of the tips that they gave us that I found the most helpful, is just starting that interaction with two things. One is, how would you like to be addressed? And two, then taking the opportunity before you ask them all these personal questions to help them understand why we're asking and what we're going to do with it. Next slide. So we're going to quickly go through the three questions, and as you can tell, the other thing I wanted to mention is, as an attachment to this training, there are two things, because when I was talking briefly earlier about just people having anxiety, there was a lot of anxiety around different ethnicity groups, and there's a lot of, and language. So I wanted you to know that there are, we have provided the three questions in our 5 threshold languages here in San Francisco. So that is attached, and that's Spanish, Chinese, Russian, Tagalog, and Vietnamese. There's also another attachment. It's a glossary of definitions that we received from Open House. And just be mindful that these definitions evolve over time. So it is something that you can use now to just get a general understanding and idea. But just for all of us, in the vein of, cultural humility, taking classes or reaching out to services for the LGBT community partners, sometimes these definitions are going to change over time. So please be mindful of that, and check in regularly with some of these agencies or whoever ends up being kind of your point of contact for the LGBTQ community. So the first question that we're going to ask, next slide, is, what is your gender? And the other tip that they gave us is that sometimes when people are confused by a question, if you start the answers, it'll become clear to them what you're asking. So you're going to say, what is your gender? And you'll start male, female, trans male, trans female, gender queer, gender non-binary, or not listed. When you ask this question and you're trying to have a comfort level in case somebody asks you a question, the ones that stick out to me are transgender. So being able to explain in a real concise way, if somebody says, well, what does trans mean? And then you would say, transgender is an individual where their gender identity, gender expression differs from that of their sex identified at birth. And for genderqueer, gender non-binary, those are umbrella terms for individuals who do not fit or identify within the binary system, which is the slide that we had earlier, the colorful slide. They identify outside or in between the traditional binary male-female boxes, gender boxes. And that might be the easiest way to describe it to people, is basically that they don't fit within those traditional boxes of male-female, that they're somewhere in between or outside of. Next question. Next slide. Sex. What was your sex at birth? Male, female. One way to describe this, if they haven't heard this phrase before, is that you can then say to them as a clarification, what does it say on your birth certificate? And that might be another way for them to help understand what you may be asking. Next slide. Lastly, how do you describe your sexual orientation or sexual identity? Same thing, you would start the answers. Straight, heterosexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian, same gender loving, questioning, or not listed, or decline to answer. If you remember earlier in our presentation, sexual orientation is the physical, romantic, or emotional attachment to someone of the same sex or the opposite sex. So when you're talking about straight or heterosexual, that's with someone of the opposite sex. Bisexual could be male or female. Gay, lesbian, same gender is those of the same sex. Next slide. So like I was talking about earlier, it's really important to potentially do some role playing, and that those opportunities can help you get to that comfort level even before you launch. It's really, a lot of times when you guys work with each other, one can be the client, one can be the provider, and then even have a third person be an observer who can give you kind of feedback after you've had the exchange. But it's a good opportunity for someone to be kind of, there's different things that they kind of could predict, and it's a good way of preparing. Next slide. So once again, the observer is going to be the person who pays attention. They're going to be paying attention to kind of the tone and the body language and the eye contact, and also giving you feedback on what they heard. So that's a good opportunity to have that third person involved. And it's okay. I think sometimes people get kind of self-conscious and they're worried that if they're going to say something, and so the last statement is, it's okay to also use oops and ouch in your feedback if somebody said something unintentionally, but to help people understand that those words could be hurtful. And that's part of role playing, and that's how we learn, is that we make those missteps and that it's a safe place to do that. So please use the opportunity to use the example coming up of the role plays. So next slide. When Open House was talking to us about it, they said that there's really kind of 3 traditional reactions that people might have. And this first one, scenario, is one of a confused client. And the confused client may be asking a lot of questions. And so that's what the person would do as the client. And it kind of gives you the opportunity to be able to explain things. And it also kind of pushes you to take that opportunity to create a teachable moment. And so that's a good role play to kind of help you work on those skills, to have a teachable moment. Next slide. The next scenario is a reactive client, which I think is people's biggest fear, is that they're going to have a client that has a reaction. And it's important when we're working with reactive clients that you always remember to remain calm, do not escalate, reiterate our goals, and remind them that the question is voluntary. So when we do a scenario, we want the client to get kind of agitated and upset, and what are you saying? Are you saying I'm gay? Things like that. Those are some examples. And that it's our job to be very calm. And to reiterate, we ask these questions of everyone, and we ask these questions because we want to understand the clients that we're serving so that we can provide better services in the future. It's the perfect opportunity to explain to people. Now, your goal is not to agitate further and not to escalate. So if they continue, you give them the option and you say, would you like to move on to the next question? So that's a wonderful opportunity to use all those skills. And then next slide. Lastly, the third opportunity that they talked about is the reluctant LGBT client. And that's providing kind of a level of sensitivity to understanding where this client's concerns might be and where they've come from historically. So if somebody seems like, well, what are you going to do with this information? Is this going to be in a computer, and what are they going to do with it? It's just reiterating our goals. And we're asking these questions. We take all this information in an aggregate form. And what we do with that information is so that we can have better services in the future. One really good question that I had from another group was, they said, well, what does that really mean, providing better services in the future? And one of the things that we wanted to, which makes perfect sense, you can say it, but what does that really mean? And so one example here in San Francisco is that they did a survey of the homeless youth, and they realized, I think about 33% of roughly about a third of the homeless youth, maybe even higher, were LGBT young individuals. And so what they did is they set up a homeless shelter in our mission district that really focused and provided services to this LGBT young homeless individuals. And so what I wanted people to understand is, when we got that information, it shaped the services that we provided. And that's the same for anybody that we serve. That's why we're asking these questions. We're asking these questions because it helps us understand the clients and what their service needs are, and then we can respond with appropriate programming. So I appreciated that question, and if people have anything, any other questions about that, I think it's good to understand what you're saying to folks, so that if they ask questions like that, you can explain it. Next slide. Great. So I think that we're going to be going back to Alexis, and she'll talk about a little bit about the resources. Thank you.
Thank you to Melissa, Tom, and Dana for a great presentation. I found the best practice recommendation to embrace cultural humility, along with the actual practical tips to do that, to be extremely useful, and I'm hoping that folks on the line also have a takeaway for themselves, a new perspective, or that new nugget of info that they can take back and apply to their daily work. So thank you again for a great presentation with very useful content. So before we wrap up today, I want to highlight a couple of relevant resources for folks on the line. So first, we've posted both in this webinar slide set online and on our usual ACL page, the department's cross-program guidance on implementation of AB 959 and SB 179. We touched on those today, but AB 959 requires counties to request the voluntary self-identification data on sexual orientation and gender identities, and then SB 179, which is separate but somewhat related, legally recognizes non-binary as a third gender option for identification documents issued by the state of California. So the SOGI, or Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Data Collection form, includes an option for clients to select non-binary as a response for gender identity. We have received some questions on the specific letter. We will be following up offline. Just wanted to make the connections for folks between today's discussion and the formal policy letter that went out so that you can reference those together. As well as some additional resources that are linked here in the slides and will be posted to the website. The San Francisco AAA agency's translated questions handout, as well as Open House's glossary of terms and definitions handout. And then again, for additional reference, the LGBT Aging at the Golden Gate. It's a San Francisco policy issues and recommendations document that can be useful as you do this work in your own community. And then links to the National Resource Center on LGBT Aging and SAGE Advocacy and Services for LGBT Elders. Again, great sources for additional resources. And then, because I am like a broken record, I will make one last plug for our next webinar in the guest speaker webinar series. We'll be meeting on April 2nd from 10:30 to 11:30 a.m., not p.m. I will be asleep by then. That slide has a small typo. But we will be discussing serving people with disabilities with guest speakers from the Department of Rehabilitation and the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. So we hope that you join us. With that, I want to thank everyone again for joining the call and wish you a happy Tuesday. Thanks